So, so we can start. So, good afternoon to everyone, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome you to Ismail again for this second time. And Ismail is the International Association for Mediterranean and Oriental Studies based in Rome, Italy. Through the organization of conferences, meetings, presentation, publication, and archaeological campaigns, Ismail promotes study, research, and cultural collaboration related to countries of Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean basin. So at Ismail, we created this music series called Oriental Music Conversation as a platform to share newest scholarly and creative work with the members and the public. My name is Salvatore Morra, and I'm the music curator of Ismail. The conversation is recorded and it will last for about 15 minutes, after which we will take audience questions for 10 minutes. At any time during the event, you can use the chat feature on your screen to submit your questions, and please mute yourself during the talk. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Martin Stokes, who is the King Edward Professor of Music at King's College of London. Today, his work has focused on questions of ethnicity, identity, globalization, the history of ethnomusicology, and folk music study, particularly on modern Turkey and Egypt, with broader interests across the Mediterranean and Europe. So welcome to this second conversation of the series with the title Al-Halim Bicycle, a Postcolonial Nocturne. And Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Mora, for inviting me in the first place. I'm very honored to be invited, and looking forward to our Oriental music conversation. Thanks also to everybody else in the ISMAO Directorate and Administration for all of their work in making this happen. It's lovely to see already so many old friends gathered on the screen here, and I hope you are all well. I hope that you are surviving this terrible period that we're all going through. I hope that you're in good health, and I hope that we will soon be through this and once again sitting around a table and talking to one another about academic matters and all others, as we always used to and as we always should do. What I'm going to talk about today actually is a reflection on some ongoing work concerning the figure of the musical citizen. I've been interested for quite some time in how the ideals and imagination of citizenship as a kind of political belonging project, currently, of course, under a lot of stress and pressure, is projected on music and musicians. And one of the examples that I've been thinking about and looking at is the case of al-Halim Hafiz, an Egyptian singer. Most of my research has been on Turkish music, actually, but over the last 20 years or so, I've had a strong, it's been a kind of hobby, except I would say it was a kind of hobby, but it's got completely out of hand. But I've had a long-standing interest in Egyptian music as well. So I'm reflecting a little bit on that research. I'm very happy to share it with you. Very happy for any comments or questions or corrections or just anything that you want to say about al-Halim Hafiz. I would be delighted to hear it. He's a very fascinating individual, a very fascinating musician, and I feel there's a lot to say about him. So rather than reading a paper, or at least reading a paper from the outset, I will want to show you some slides which will just quickly give you an idea of where the argument is situated and who it is that I'm talking about. So if you will allow me just to negotiate the screen sharing here in a second, you should be able to see my shared screen.
You cannot share?
Here we go. Yes, I think we're okay.
Oh.
So hopefully we're there. And I will rely on Salva waving his hands to tell me if there's any problem with what it is that you are seeing. So al-Halim's Bicycle, a Postcolonial Nocturne, is my fanciful title. For those of you who are not familiar with him, Abd al-Halim Hafiz lived between 1929 and 1977. He was a musician with one foot in the classical tradition and another foot in the popular music world, very much associated with the Nasserite revolution in the 1950s. He was a singer, he was an oboe player, and he was a film star. His first film was Lahn al-Wafa of 1955. There was one last film, Abi for Ashagara, of what was that, 1967, as I recall, but that in some ways is a bit of an exception. I'm actually going to be talking about the last, as it were, normal film that Abd al-Halim made, which was Ma'budat al-Gamahir of 1963. But those coordinates there, 1955 to 1963, cover a period in which he made, what was it, 17 or so films, which are immensely popular in Egypt up to this day. What was interesting about Abd al-Halim Hafiz, to cut a very long story short, is that he started off being associated with the Nasserite revolution. His music was very much, his singing was very much a statement of the post-colonial identities and struggles of the time, associated therefore with modernity, with revolution, and with, let me just say, forward-looking political projects. By the early years of the 2000s, he was underwent a process of kind of recuperation by the establishment, the musical establishment, the cultural establishment, the political establishment, if you will. He was appropriated, I suppose you could say. It's interested me that this has involved a kind of political whitewash, I suppose we could say, and the Ahmed Zeki biopic of just called Halim of 2006 is an instantiation of that. It was also a kind of musical whitewash. So this kind of poppy 1950s, 1960s sound, kind of very westernized in certain ways, to use rather crude language, had become by the 1970s and the 1980s something much more part of the mainstream of Arab classical music, of the latter Kulthum, the latter Muhammad Abdul Wahab, the Urniya format that they popularized. So a very interesting kind of process of kind of political and musical kind of bringing into the mainstream and turning him into a kind of strange figure of nostalgia around about the latter Mubarak years. On my last visit to Egypt, which was just before the pandemic, to buy a new Qanun, I discovered his new statue at the Opera building alongside Kulthum, who you can see in the background, and Abdul Wahab is somewhere around the corner. So this seems to mark the kind of final stage, as it were, of his kind of recruitment into the pantheon of Egyptian classical music. And so it's a long and interesting and complicated journey, and one that did not stop him from being a figure of some significance in the Tahrir demonstrations and revolution. And so, something about his old revolutionary identity has not been forgotten. And this is what interests me as regards this whole question about the citizen, the Muwatin, in the Egyptian context. I'm thankful to Ted Swedenborg, who saw the advertisement for this talk and immediately sent me by Facebook this picture of Abd al-Halim with his bicycle, because one of the key facets of the iconography of Abd al-Halim is his bicycle. And this is interesting because, as you can see, it says at the bottom, this is a very early picture. He was just 21 years old at the time. Abd al-Halim, back in the Hara, back in his home patch, and that image of him with his bicycle is quite iconic. Thanks to Ted Swedenborg. I don't know if he's listening, but thanks to him for sending me that lovely picture, which I assume must come from one of these popular cultural journals like Kawakib or something like that. The question of the bicycle has not been much discussed from a post-colonial angle. And one of the first things I did when I was trying to understand the relationship between al-Halim and his bicycle, and why this image was just such, has become such a powerful, the image of al-Halim on his bicycle has become so powerfully iconic. I Googled the post-colonial bicycle and found nothing. I then emailed all of the friends of mine who are both academics and very keen cyclists, and said, has anybody written an interesting history of the bicycle from a post-colonial perspective or a non-European perspective, including some extremely erudite people. I mean, I really did ask around on this subject and I found nothing. So the post-colonial bicycle, it does strike me as being a kind of strangely neglected topic. You will, however, find an article by Anthony Appiah, published in Public Culture, sorry, not Public Culture. Sorry, I've momentarily forgotten the name of the journal, about post-colonialism and postmodernism, which contains a long discussion of a piece of African culture, of Yoruba sculpture, just known as the man with bicycle, which was displayed at the Center for African Art in New York in 1987, and was the subject of a number of short essays written by various critics at the time. And although Appiah is not very interested in the post-colonial bicycle, James Baldwin, the great author, African-American author, was, and it was his essay in this that struck my attention. He said this of the Yoruba man with bicycle. He said, "He's really going to town. It's very jaunty, very authoritative. His errand might also prove to be impossible. He's challenging something, or something has challenged him. He's grounded in immediate reality by the bicycle. He's apparently a very proud and silent man. He's dressed sort of polyglot. Nothing looks like it fits him too well." Now, what interests me, apart from all of these rather perceptive comments that Baldwin is making, is that he's the only person in this collection, as far as I can understand, who wants to talk about the cyclists and not the cycle. Okay, he immediately sees the figure of the cyclist as being of interest and significance here, and he's immediately interpreting it, it seems to me, in kind of crypto-political terms here. Sort of subtly political terms here. He's going to town. Okay, the jauntiness, the authoritativeness, the difficulty of the challenge, this grounding in immediate reality. I mean, these are all very interesting kind of comments. And of course, the more you know about James Baldwin, the more one gets a sense of just how resonant this kind of post-colonial cyclist was to him. So Baldwin's comments that I stumbled across when reading Appiah's essay constitute a kind of starting point for me for thinking about the post-colonial bicycle. So it sort of pushes me in the direction of thinking not of the post-colonial bicycle, but the post-colonial bicyclist. A second starting point, again, on another recent trip to Cairo, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, is the slow appearance of bicycles on the streets of Cairo. Now, I don't know how many people listening know Cairo, but one thing anybody who has been there will know is that the attempt to cycle in Cairo today is to risk almost certain death. It's a fundamentally kind of suicidal proposition, just given the nature of the traffic and the state of the roads and the state of the cars at the moment. But nonetheless, it interested me to see round about the downtown area, Wustel Balad, I think the Qasr al-Aini street, which is what you're looking at there on the right, a cycle lane, and two brave cyclists, women, young women, both of them, who were slowly pushing their way along this cycle lane. And it turns out that there is a serious effort to install cycle lanes around Egypt and in Cairo in particular. It's been pushed by a joint initiative between an NGO called Tebdil, I think it's called, by the Cairo Governorate, and various consultancies, one of which is a cycling consultancy called Copenhagenize, I never quite know how to pronounce that, who are a kind of consultancy for teaching municipalities how to introduce the bike onto the streets. Now, it's hard to be optimistic about the future of Cairo's Copenhagenization, but nonetheless, it is a fact. It's been discussed by an interesting Egyptian commentator whose work whose blogging I can recommend, Ahmed Tariq al-Ahwal. Mikhail Colville-Anderson is evidently associated with Copenhagenize, and he's another person who's very interested in the history of cycling in Cairo. Two things to observe. One is the great difficulty that these initiatives will have, I think, persuading people to get on their bikes in the first place. Secondly, the process seems to be encountering all sorts of serious planning issues. So you have cycle lanes where way out in the desert where no cycle can possibly, there's absolutely no need for it at all. And I'm afraid to say it does seem to be rather badly planned. And another aspect of this is that cycling is more about the push with cycling seems more directed to the inhabitants of the gated communities. So cycling is already being imagined as a kind of adjunct to a fundamentally car-based and sort of rather American suburbanized gated community existence, rather than as a kind of serious transformation of urban space. So Cairo is Copenhagenizing. Good luck to it, of course. The history of the bike in Egypt turns out to be quite a difficult one to determine, and the best sources, it seems to me, are collections of photos that you will find online, and Mikhail Colville-Anderson's wonderful photos are extremely revealing. But so too are films. A very interesting moment in Naguib Errehani's Salama Fahir of 1937, a very early film, which my friend Yara Salahuddin directed to me when I raised this topic of conversation. I don't know whether anybody's seen this film, but there's a moment in the film where Naguib Errehani has to carry a large amount of money across Cairo, and immediately he encounters a bicycle thief. He sees the bicycle thief, you see there on the left, cycling towards him, but going past him and snatching the handbag of the young woman that you see on the picture on the right. So he immediately goes into a panic, and every time he sees a cyclist, he clutches this bag full of money to his chest in a state of complete panic. Then, in a sudden wonderful kind of visual twist that is worthy of Jacques Tati in French cinema, he suddenly finds himself in the middle of a group of sports cyclists, as you can see on the right of the screen there, who are evidently involved in some kind of bike race around Cairo. Immediately goes into a panic, tucks the money under his arm and just starts running. And then for the next 2 or 3 minutes, you just have this absurd scene of Naguib Errehani running with this bag full of money, surrounded by this sort of peloton of sports cyclists. So in 1937, it just seems to me quite interesting. You have the bicycle already seemingly having been adopted by Cairo's poor and underclass, and associated with kind of rather threatening young men. But clearly, on the one hand, it was a kind of working class way of getting around the city, associated with these kind of figures of labor or of trade. But somewhere around then, 1937, it had become, the bicycle had become associated with sports clubs, again, all young men at this point, and associated much more with the elite. So I haven't studied this film in quite as much detail as I might, but I feel sure that this 1937 film already tells us something quite interesting about what the bicycle meant in Cairo in the 1930s, and tells us something quite interesting about the social stratification and the kind of anxieties and threats about class and about urban space that it was associated with. So moving on now to 1963, and two scenes from al-Halim's film Mabudat al-Gamahir, which are, if the al-Halim and his bicycle are iconic in Egyptian popular culture, then these two scenes are kind of doubly iconic, or icons of the icon. I mean, these really are the absolute essence. If you just type into Google in Arabic al-Halim on his bicycle, these two things will immediately come up. So the film was made in 1963, as I recall, and the two songs in questions are Ahibbik, I Love You, the song by his companion and composer Mohammed Mugi, words by Musi Gamal Aziz, and the second film is Haga Ghariba, A Strange Thing, which is a duet with his great singing star Shadia, song by Munir Murad, who didn't write many songs for him, but those that he did are well known, and words by Hussein Sayed, who was one of his standard lyricists. These are both up-tempo songs, multi-sectional songs, multi-maqam songs, having lots of different kind of maqam modalities at play in them. Multiple iqar, which is to say kind of multiple kind of rhythmic modes. If you look at the transcriptions that people come up with, they get labeled foxtrot and allegretto and things like this. Highly orchestrated, in heavy inverted commas, let's just say a highly westernized sound. Note too, just before I show you these some very brief clips, that we are clearly in what is clearly Cairo, but also a kind of fantasy city, and we're looking at very implausible bike rides. Now, please just allow me to switch to YouTube clips. So this will take a little fiddling on my part, please. If you can just bear with me for one moment. Right, so I am now going to share my screen again. And so the first of these two scenes is this one, Ahibbik. I'll just show you the beginning of this.
أحبك 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 كلمة بقالها يمونة اللي تدوب فيا عايزة تروح لك كنت بعيدة 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 عليا أحبك كلمة بقالها يمونة اللي تدوب فيا عايزة تروح لك وانت بعيدة 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 عليا كلمة اللي أنا عايش بيها هدوب كل الشوق فيها كلمة اللي أنا عايش بيها هدوب كل الشوق فيها وهقولها وأعدها وأغنيها
so that's the first cycling scene at the very beginning of the film. Here is the second somewhere in the middle. Again, I won't say much, but I'll just let you observe and listen.
حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة الدنيا لها طعم جديد حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة أنا حاسس إن ده يوم عيد
وانا حاسه الدنيا هربانه ويانا بالليل كله سعاده وانا حاسه الدنيا هربانه ويانا بالليل كله سعاده كده فرحه حلوه عليا وحلاوتها سكرها زياده كده فرحه حلوه عليا وحلاوتها سكرها زيادة انت عارف ليه
قولي انت ليه
علشان احنا مع بعضينا والاول مرة لوحدينا ولا حدش بيبص علينا غير فرحة قلبنا وعنينا
حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة حاجة غريبة الليل ده كله كان امبارح.
Okay, so I'll just go back onto my PowerPoints. So please excuse me one moment whilst I just renegotiate things. There we go. So, yes, back to my argument and discussion here. Hopefully you'll have noticed that in both cases we have this rather up-tempo, this kind of foxtrot, allegretto, up-tempo, quote-unquote westernized feel, multi-sectional that keeps on stopping and starting and changing within a certain band of affect, if you will. You can already hear in both of those examples how the composers switch from one maqam to another and from one iqa, one rhythmic mode to another. You can hear the highly kind of wrought and orchestrated nature of the whole thing. Of course, you saw that we're in a fantasy city here, and this is fantasy cycle riding. No need to steer the bike. No need to steer the bicycle. No need to put the brakes on. No need to look where you're going. Off he goes. He just sings away as he goes on these rather kind of fantastic cycle rides. Notice the difference between the two scenes. Haga Ghariba, the second one, takes place at night, and the cyclists are being pursued by a car. So the key difference I'd like to just draw your attention to right at the outset is that one is a scene in daylight, the other is a scene in the dark. One is a scene involving the singer as a soloist, the other is a duet. What else did I want to point out? The other is a scene in which the cyclist is going rather fast, and in the second one, the cycle is going slower and has got this car following it. There's something I want to suggest already about this second scene that has a slight sense of threat about it. Even though these are comedy films, these are light-hearted films, that there is something, a shadow, I want to suggest hangs over this second scene in particular. The lovers are being pursued by the journalists who are trying to get a picture of these two famous singers because they're looking for the paparazzi, they're looking for a scoop for the newspapers. And already by the early 1960s, there's a slight shadow over this because al-Halim's own life story becomes to be kind of part of the way in which these films are understood and consumed. So those are the two images, and that's the contrast I wanted very quickly to draw. Concerning the fantasy nature of this, I decided in a whimsical moment that I was going to try and reconstruct the cycle ride of Ahibbak, and I got out my Google Maps. The first thing you discover is that if you try and find a route between two places in Cairo, you know how you have a walking option and a public transport option and a car option and a cycle option. Well, when you press the cycle option icon, it just says I can't do it. So there's no cycle option for getting around Cairo. So this is the walked version of this. People listening may know Cairo much better than me, but it seems to me, again, this is not a scientific, I don't have a scientific grasp of this at all. This is an exercise of whimsy on my part. It seems to me we start off somewhere around Bab al-Luk. We're definitely heading in the direction of Ataba, which we see momentarily. But then a few seconds later, we're cycling along these broad tree-lined avenues, which I think must be somewhere in Zamalek. It must be somewhere here on the way to the Gezira Sporting Club. I have that impression. So we've gone in that direction, and then all of a sudden, magically, we're over here. And then I think we end up in the Hara, in the traditional neighborhood, which the closest would be Bulaq, I'm guessing, which would require getting back over the river. All of this within the space of 8 minutes. And as you can already see, thanks to Google Maps, we're talking about a 2-hour, 6-minute walk. So what? I don't know, a 45-minute cycle ride or something like that, all somehow compressed into an 8-minute song, but the directions are all wrong and everything is all wrong about it. It doesn't matter. It's fun. It's a laugh. It's lighthearted. It's comedy cinema. It's not supposed to be realistic. But the kind of fantasy element of this cycle ride does seem to me to be interesting. I'm going to turn for another 20 minutes, if I may, to my text, which I'll present in a shortened form of the argument in my slides. So if I'm speaking too quickly or making no sense, hopefully my slides will explain where my argument is going. And the basic premise of what Joel Gordon, who is a historian of Egyptian film, calls the revolutionary melodrama of the 1950s and 1960s, was to co-opt sentimental plots, artful cinematography, and great songs into the fashioning of the Nasserite citizen. Romantic love in these films, and music too, was shown improving the lives of those it touched. These revolutionary films depicted young men like al-Halim learning through love and through music to serve others and participate in society, learning to understand the relationship between tradition and progress, learning to live sensitively but exuberantly. These revolutionary films also recognized, very frankly, the unequal demands they placed on men and women. In its gendered and sexual arrangements, the worlds these films had inherited, this revolutionary melodrama had inherited, was both a harsh and a broken one after all. Women were to be under no illusions about the challenges of modern revolutionary citizenship in a country like Egypt. But the lesson men and women were expected to learn as couples were fundamentally the same. Democracy in revolutionary Egypt, as elsewhere in the 1960s, was, to quote philosopher Luce Irigaray, was to begin with two. The bicycle, I would suggest, in the light of Marbutat al-Gamahir, both underlined and extended these lessons in revolutionary citizenship. Firstly, it clarified what we might call, following Iris Marion Young, a historian and theorist, what Iris Young called the necessity of the city. Without, as she put it in a well-known essay, the physical historicity of the city, without the architectural sedimentation of different histories, rather than the imposition of a single vision, without, as she put it, the experience of aesthetic inexhaustibility, the pleasure in detail and surprise such a city provides, and without the active constitution of public spaces, streets, restaurants, concert halls, parks, and the possibilities these afford for intimate interactions with strangers, democratic citizenship, she argued, cannot survive. So the bicycle is portrayed in Ma'budat al-Gamahir not just as a kind of urban connecting device, but as a kind of urban agency, a kind of agency of Nasserite citizenship. By allowing an individual on a whim, just on a desire to traverse the city from old to new, from its elites to its poor, in minutes, it fashions an awareness of the city's sedimented history, its omnivorous yet sensitive sociability, a constantly changing experience of detail and surprise. Remember that it is revolutionary, democratic, and romantic love that makes these journeys necessary in the first place. So that's point number one I would like to make about the bicycle here. It's associated with a certain kind of civility, a certain kind of experience of the possibility, the kind of democratic possibility of the city itself at this historical moment. The bicycle is also portrayed in Ma'budat al-Gamahir as key to the night. The Nasserite state invested heavily in nocturnal festivity. Kulthum's concerts, which would start late, could last up to 6 hours. As Virginia Danielson observes in her study of Kulthum, these were displays of strength and stamina, not without revolutionary significance. But the conquest of the night has a long history in Ottoman cities, amongst which Cairo must still historically be counted. Ottoman historian Cem Kafadar connects the growing coffee trade and the manufacture of lighting materials like oil and glass to Istanbul's transformation into an imperial metropolis in the mid-17th century. Coffee in Istanbul was, in its time, bitterly resisted, a position amusingly satirized with an eye on today's religious opponents of urban nightlife by Orhan Pamuk in his novel My Name is Red. Perhaps some of you know it. Night was a scene of contest and anxiety in the early modern Ottoman city too, as Kafadar shows. It was the domain of ancient drinking cultures maintained by the Greeks, Jews, and Armenians. It was the domain of rowdy gangs of young men from the Anatolian countryside looking for fun. It was the domain of millennial mystics chanting and spinning the night away. No wonder the Ottoman state saw the night as a challenge. It became a space on which it would impose an alternative vision of society, build an industry upon it, and present it to their subjects as a sign of civility. So Cem Kafadar teaches us. Consumerism and rural-urban migration in the 1950s boosted nightlife in cities like Istanbul and Cairo, as it did across the developing world. But so too did revolution. As in Shanghai, as in Havana, as in Kinshasa, nightlife was a post-colonial proposition, vital to the symbolic and emotional recruitment of the new state's citizens. I'll cut here, but a number of ethnomusicologists have been interested in the revolutionary nightlife. Robin Moore's work on Cuba in the 1950s. Let me see, Farah and Field's work on nightlife in Shanghai in the 1950s. Bob White's excellent book about nightlife in the Congo, in its capital city, Kinshasa. Kinshasa in the 1950s are things that I find myself thinking about here. So nightlife as a kind of revolutionary kind of project. The night is not just daytime extended by artificial lighting and stimulants. The night is quite its own project, as Will Straw has observed in his brilliant writing on the subject. Gas and electricity, agents of the conquest of the night, produce not just light, he reminds us, but flickering shadows. The night's ambiguous meanings have always drawn on this unstable dialectic between light and shade. So too have they drawn on social anxieties about the shifting composition of the nighttime crowd as urban work patterns, transport systems, and media systems changed. So there's ambiguity, I want to suggest, hovering over this idea of nightlife. Even as it was a kind of revolutionary project and spoke about revolutionary possibilities for the refashioning of post-colonial society, some sense of ambiguity and some sense of threat hung over it. So Haga Ghariba, I mean, these two cycling scenes are to be read, I would suggest, as a kind of post-colonial nocturne. The bicycle underlines the opportunities the night affords a young couple, not simply for escape, but also for access to urban public space, for urban participation. If al-Halim's bicycle invites us to think about access to and mobility within urban space as a facet of citizenship, it also invites us to think about the speed of that mobility and access. The city in these films is always encountered as at speed. Technicolor, an important cinema industry innovation in these years, with its wide screen ratios and more sophisticated sound, encouraged long tracking shots, supplementing the reverse shot of classic black and white cinematography. Egyptian filmmakers and their audiences quickly developed a taste for city scenes observed as though from or taking place within a speeding vehicle. How often the camera swoops and swerves through the city in al-Halim films, along with him and the other film characters, evoking the excitement and bewilderment of a world not only changing, but changing for the better. The pursuit of bicycle by car in Ma'budat al-Gamahir suggests distinctions, though, between kinds of speed, or more accurately, the question of the payoff between speed and agility. The lovers in the film outwit the paparazzi in the first round of this contest, but not the next. This is not a race after all, but a battle of wits. A slower vehicle, like the bicycle, might get you to where you and your lover need to be more quickly, a place of privacy away from home. It might also allow for a more agile traverse of the urban social landscape. The bicycle too might simply be more fun, keeping your spirits high, your joie de vivre bubbling. In al-Halim's films, these are presented as the cardinal social and citizenly virtues. They are made possible, I would underline here, by the bicycle. Okay, so the bike as an agent of a certain kind of speed and agility, I think, feeds into this citizenship narrative here. Now, things were changing in the 1960s, and by the beginning of the 1970s, they had completely changed. In 1973, not long after Ma'budat al-Gamahir was made, French social theorist André Gortz wrote a polemic entitled "The Social Ideology of the Motor Car." His central argument these days seems completely unarguable or unassailable. The freedom promised by motor transport, he said, had already been undermined by its compulsory nature. The social distinctions it promised, allowing people with money to get there quicker, had been undermined by the uniformly slow speed of traffic. The distance the motor car made by extending spatial relations is greater than the distance it overcomes. The time we spent driving and earning the money to keep our cars on the road already meant that we were now moving, calculated on average over a lifetime, at less than walking pace. This was Gortz's radical argument against the car in 1973 in The Social Ideology of the Motor Car. What is the answer to this absurdity, he asks. If cars are to be compulsory, the solution is simple, he says, and with biting irony: abolish the city, a solution he felt North American suburbanization had already arrived at. Ethnomusicologist Mark Slobin, reflecting on these years in a recent book from so-called Motor City, Detroit, sees things oppositely. and from, as obviously, an American perspective. Detroit was, obviously enough, a city made by cars and for cars. And as the world knows, Detroit's cars lay symbolically and experientially at the heart of North American popular culture and music. In a book filled with driving and road planning metaphors, Slobin shows how the car and the city built around it anchored a fragile civility, bringing Black and immigrant music together in the city and unleashing a powerful creativity. Indeed, Detroit's musical achievements, Mark Slobin argues, rested on it. Andre Gortz's abolition of the city, to the extent that such a project might be said to have succeeded in a suburbanized North America and to have wrecked Detroit in the process, has not produced anything comparable. The views from Paris and Detroit about the car's relation to the city, civility, and citizenship may not be easy to reconcile. al-Halim's bicycle offers an alternative to the critical imagination, though, and one that's not entirely incompatible with either. It acknowledges that the citizen needs the city in the senses proposed by Iris Young, the experience of diversity, of layered, built, sedimented history, of detail and surprise, as she puts it. It shows how this experience might be pleasurable, exuberant, witty, progressive, and above all, gregarious, all of which words are at play to greater or lesser extent in that prized Egyptian social virtue, hifet dem, lightness of blood. On his bike rides, he sings to the trees and to the greenery. He greets workmen and shopkeepers in the street. He kisses his mother. He strokes his cat. From the outset, all of these journeys are motivated by love. Gortz notes in passing the importance not just of restoring the joy of transport, but of love for, as he puts it, one's own territory as the key to the coming revolution. Here is a picture then of how the city's detail and surprise might be reconciled with the re-enchantment of territory in a society in revolutionary motion. Okay, I'm coming to the end of my time, and I think rather than reading any more, I'll just quickly say a few more things about where this argument goes, and then I'll stop and I'll throw the floor open to any questions and observations that you might have. But just to summarize, so these scenes are about movement around the city, and what I'm calling the necessity of the city. These are scenes that talk about the conquest of the night, okay, as sort of scenes of revolutionary citizenship making. These are scenes of speed, okay. This is about speed and agility. The bicycle being presented as an image of speed and social speed and agility as a kind of revolutionary sign. The last thing that I wanted to touch on, and I won't speak about it any length, is where singing, what singing and music have to do with this. Like, you know, why it's so important that we see al-Halim singing on his bike. And what's important here, I want to suggest, is that the bicycle is presented as being connected in these films with the kind of mechanical complexity of the music. Okay, the bicycle is a feat of industrial engineering, of technocratic expertise. So too is the singing and the composition and the playing of these songs. Now, in a musical context, this raises the question of, if you present something, music, as somehow being mechanical or mechanized, or as it were, on wheels, that one immediately within the Egyptian cultural universe runs into the question of where is the joy, where is the spirit, where is the emotion, where is the tarab, to use this extremely ideological and extremely important expression. And one of the features of al-Halim's art and the way in which he has been understood in Egypt is that he is simultaneously the end of the era of tarab, of enchantment, as it were, the good old virtues of the classical music and the enchantment that is associated with it, but that it is also a modernizer. Okay, he's also brought the idea of the modern division of labor. The composer does this, the conductor does that, the arranger does that, the singer does that, the still musicians do that, the orchestral players do that. Okay, so this music I want to suggest is a scene of kind of technical expertise and mastery. Tim Mitchell, in his writing about Egyptian history, talks about the rule of experts and the advent of technopolitics. And I want to suggest that music is participates in this this kind of technocratic image of the kind of revolutionary remaking of society. And it does so with a particular intensity through this kind of icon of the singing cyclist. There is melancholy attached to this and nostalgia. Here is the melancholy, a young and handsome and energetic young man, reduced at the end of his life. My guess is that picture is probably from 1976, rehearsing probably in the Sheraton Hotel with his El Marcia, his great ensemble, confined to a wheelchair. Okay, so now when we're looking back at these films and sort of thinking about the iconicity of al-Halim on his bicycle, there are two kind of rather tragically opposed kind of images of, as it were, songs on wheels, or the singer on wheels, the bicycle on one hand and the wheelchair to which he was confined later in life. And nostalgia. I'll just conclude by recalling in 2015 with an orchestra, the King's Philharmonia, with the King's Big Band Jazz, with the King's College Chapel Choir. With the aid of a whole team of students, we rescored one of these al-Halim film songs, and it was the classic final song of al-Halim's very first movie, also starring Shadia, called Lahn al-Wafa, the Song of Faithfulness. It's a huge orchestral number. There are no orchestral scores for this, so we just listened to the recordings of the film and reorchestrated it and put it on in a performance at the King's Cultural Festival. We had maybe 200, 250 people in the audience. I think the vast majority of them were from London's Egyptian community, and mostly people who see themselves very much as part of the nostalgia for these years of revolutionary melodrama, if you will, from the 1950s and the 1960s. It had a very great effect, it seemed to me, to have on them, because restoring the orchestra and restoring all of that kind of, as I'm describing it, sort of techno-political, expertise, as it were, to this music, all of that kind of division of labor, all of that intricacy, all of that orchestration, brings something back into this music which has been actively forgotten over much of the last 20 years, as the figure of al-Halim has been kind of recuperated by the authoritarian regimes at the end of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. Something in the music, something in the image of al-Halim cycling around Cairo, singing these merry tunes as he goes, focuses in an iconic fashion, focuses a nostalgia for a revolution that is still alive, I think, in people's mind, even if it isn't alive on the streets, and keeps the iconicity of this picture of the singer and his bicycle alive and powerful. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And thanks for listening in English. I never underestimate what's involved there, although of course you'll have understood it well. Thanks also for allowing me to move between some rather general reflections and reading a bit of text, but I hope that some sense of the argument and the ideas that I'm trying to put together came through. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much for this talk, Martin, and thank you for coming out from the share screen. And thank you. There's really some fascinating things, of course, they come up, and I'm really taken by your sort of cinematic listening, or we can say listening cinematically approach. So how music extends sentiments beyond the text and places that we have seen in the movie, and the practice typically associated with the film. where on the one hand there is this idea of movement, of motion, and the music through the movement, and on the other hand, this public emotionality expressed and shaped in this romantic cinema and this romantic politics. And there are some comments, I think, in the chat as first, so we can open the floor to the public, to the audience, and of course you can pop notes in the chat, or you can even raise your virtual hand and speak directly. So thanks a lot. Thanks. And there was a sort of a picture then that appeared in the chat of I don't know if anyone has downloaded it, sent out from Kaukab Tawfiq, that is one of the audience that I know that lives in Cairo. Actually, she lives in in the island that you mentioned in the map. So the actual image is.
I can't see the image, unfortunately. I'd love to see that image. I don't quite know how to.
Yeah, if Priscilla is make me the host, I can share it because I downloaded it when you were talking. So it's an image of a bread maker or bread transporter on the bicycle around in Cairo.
Thank you.
Maybe you can share the screen for show the picture.
Can I share it? Okay.
Yes, already.
Okay, sorry. Just to add a sense of what is in today's Cairo, probably. Maybe you can say it now. So
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Indeed. I lived in. I was doing research in. Thank you, Kaukab, for that lovely picture. I spent a lot of time between 2000 and 2005 living in Cairo, and I had an apartment that I stayed in every year in Sayyida Zainab, which is a kind of traditional neighborhood, and the image of the bread seller with these kind of trays on their heads carrying enormous amounts of bread around the streets and weaving their way through the cars and through very thick pedestrian traffic and tuk-tuks and goodness knows what, always used to completely amaze me. The skill and the ingenuity is remarkable, and it kind of symbolizes for me the skill and the ingenuity that's required just to survive in Cairo, which is a very difficult city. I mean, what's interesting, what was interesting 20 years ago is that the cycle was associated with the traditional neighborhoods of the city, with the old neighborhoods of the city, where there was relatively few cars, and cycles were mainly just having to deal with pedestrians rather and animals rather than rapidly moving cars. So the cycle, the bicycle was restricted to the urban working classes and poor in what one might call the traditional neighborhoods of the city, and it didn't really seem to sort of very much escape that. As somebody who loves cycling myself, I occasionally would try and rent cycles, or if I was arriving in a new city, I would ask where I could rent a bike. Had no luck. I didn't see people cycling around, and there was very, very little sense of cycling having kind of penetrated the middle classes. So this is the project of this NGO called Tebdil, and this consultancy called Copenhagenize, who are working to try and introduce some kind of cycling culture. So it's almost impossible to think about al-Halim without today and this image of him on his bike without kind of seeing it through the contemporary prism of class and urban structure on the one hand, and also kind of connecting it with the kind of impossibility, I suppose you could say, of the, you know, the almost the absurdity of the idea of the bike in Cairo as a kind of rational way of actually getting around the city. Yes, thank you for that. It's a very telling image, very good image.
Yeah, there's also a comment in the chat which is about all lower class, as you said. So it is interesting also to notice that at the same time the bike is a symbol of lower worker class, and we can find it also in many shabby singer movies video clips.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah, indeed. So, I mean, what becomes? I mean, thanks for that's actually very useful comment for me, Kaukab. Because I mean, so if al-Halim on his bicycle is a kind of sign or an icon of revolutionary citizenship, it kind of um, it says something about how it says something about a certain class reading, I think, of this very idea of citizenship now. And yeah, I mean that's what's got me thinking. Thanks.
I don't know if you if you're thinking in the same structure and the approach about this motion and the movement in motion. There is all this Hollywood, new Hollywood film that starts in the 60s from the movie The Graduate, where the musical Simon and Garfunkel and starts the movie on the platform of in the airport, and there is a sort of a sense of moving and motion and listening through the motion and the movement, which is a culture that came up in the States also from Walkman and radio, portable radios that started already, and I think it's already very well established into this movie, the fact that the bicycle, the sound of the music and the music, the rhythm changed when the in the second scene, in second clip, when they stop, when then they finish the journey and they sat down in that sort of Andalusian garden, and so the rhythm, the music changes. So the music seems sort of going with the cinematic listening, so sort of following the movement on the bicycle.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to be. Well, I mean, one thing that I mentioned in passing that's perhaps worth just thinking about a little bit more, because I'm not 100% sure that I'm right here. But I mean, Technicolor, I think, was coming into Egypt in the very early 1960s. So Technicolor, we've rather forgotten it now, but Technicolor was it was more like IMAX. You know, it was a whole technology that required basically rebuilding cinemas. Cinemas had to have this technology installed in them in order to be able to show Technicolor films. So think of IMAX today, or whenever that was, 20 years ago, and you've got some kind of an idea. And Bob Vitalis, who's a historian a very interesting historian of the Arab world, has written about this, and it's quite interesting. I mean, I would connect that these kind of long sort of tracking shots where the camera is attached to the car. So the beginning of that second song in the dark, where you're kind of looking up into the sky and you're just seeing the lights moving above you in that rather strange kind of a way, and you kind of keep on coming back to that. I mean, it's very much about, it's a kind of phantasmagoria of speed, isn't it? Of kind of moving swiftly through the urban space and what that might feel like, and all of the things associated with that. Now, to a certain extent, I see this connected to the Technicolor, the new Technicolor format. Okay, so you've got, you know, which makes possible, you've got the big screen, you've got this 8 minutes. So the genre expectation of these 8-minute songs, which was established kind of quite a long time ago. I guess I see Yara Salahuddin is listening to us, and she knows much more about this. It might have something to do with the, you know, with the dancing that was very often embedded in these things. But it, you know, my guess is, my hunch is that with the new technology, this struck filmmakers, who were a very talented bunch of people, as an opportunity to kind of, you know, fill up the visual space and fill up the kind of mini narratives going on within these songs in an interesting kind of way. So it's something that I feel inspired to connect with Technicolor, and with the kind of affordances, with the possibilities that made and that created. It does strike me, though, thinking of some of the earlier black and white al-Halim films, that there are also some marvelous kind of shots of in which the camera is clearly attached to a speeding car. So not just the car in the studio with the kind of the back projection, if you see what I mean, but you know, they've actually figured out a way of getting the camera on the car and kind of, you know, moving it through the streets. And there's some very, very striking scenes that I can think of in his films from the late 1950s. So it's clearly not just about Technicolor. It's a kind of changing imagination about the city and about speed and about, you know, who can move around the city and how they move around the city. But I think that the kind of the new Technicolor format has got something to do with it. I'm shouting out to Yara, who may or may not have gone off for a cup of tea, but she knows much more about this than me. She's raised her hand.
So, yeah, and what about this iconography of, I mean, this figure of nostalgia in al-Halim? What was the relationship between the decline of Tarab and the reappropriation of this image of nostalgia? There is a link between this idea of nostalgia and the decline of Tarab from Zaki or earlier on.
Yeah, this idea of Tarab, and for those of you who are ethnomusicologists, you'll be aware of Jihad Ras's wonderful writing on the subject. I take the slightly dissident and not very fashionable view that this idea of musical enchantment is deeply, deeply ideological. It's being projected on a certain generation. Excuse me. Sorry, please excuse me. It's been projected on a certain generation of musicians and on certain musical ideas with a great deal of intensity. So I've always, the reason I got interested in al-Halim in the first place is because of this, of the whole question of when Tarab, this kind of highly idealized, highly ideologized kind of notion about enchantment, when exactly it was supposed to finish, you know, when it came to an end. And this is where all of the debate and the discussion today seems to be about al-Halim. There are some people for whom he was the end of Tarab. There is no Tarab in al-Halim. The moment you have al-Halim, that was the end of that golden age of kind of enchantment, cultural enchantment, political enchantment, social enchantment, call it what you will. There are other people for whom he was definitely to be included in the domain of Tarab. So what's interesting for me in that regard is that he found a way of being modern, or he and his composers and his arrangers and the leader of his band found a way of adapting to the demands of the music industry at the time and the film industry at the time, but somehow being able to do so in a way that preserved the idea of Tarab. Now, Tarab is supposedly, it's about improvisation, it's about call and response, it's about listeners participating in the auditory and experiential flow of the thing. And so people will say, well, you can't have that in films. There's something authoritarian about films by their very nature. The singer is just up there singing and everybody just sits back and has these experiences kind of passively. They're not participating in them. So one of the things that's always interested me, and in the few bits of writing that I've done on the subject of al-Halim, is to ask a question about exactly that. You know, where are people defining the limits of Tarab? How are they imposing them? With what degree of ambiguity? Who is arguing what exactly about it? And with what consequence for the iconicity of al-Halim? And it still seems to me that the ambiguity of al-Halim is very much alive, I think, in his contemporary iconicity. As an ethnomusicologist, I have always been and will always be interested in ambiguous figures because they seem to kind of you know, they're always about limits. You know, they're always about how people argue about the limits of this or that. So that's to say something about why I think he's as interesting as many of my Egyptian friends do as well.
Thank you. Very fascinating. And so you can pop a note in the chat if you need to ask.
I see a raised hand from Yara Salahuddin.
All right. Okay. Or you can actually speak directly. Yara.
You can't unmute us. She needs to be given permission.
Really?
Try to unmute.
Strange.
Wait one moment.
Thanks, Priscilla.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you, Martin. That was fantastic. And I thought I'd put my hand up earlier to ask a question, but I actually was just clapping. So since then, you've actually got touched on the stuff that I wanted to talk about, which is Tarab, and, you know, this kind of idea of what it meant to be a modern citizen at this time of revolution. As you know, I'm interested in the period before the music, or rather I study currently the music that we both work on, which is considered this sort of more golden age of Tarab. Though I share your opinion, of course, on the kind of complications involved in using that term in this kind of discrete manner. So it's what is so interesting about the examples. Of course, you know, I grew up watching those two songs, and I've always found them cheesy, and I enjoyed those moments in the films for the music rather than the visual of the bike, even though it's, you know, you've made me re-enjoy them now, actually, because of what they say about Cairo and Halim as a representation of us relating to the city. So it's so interesting, and I'm still digesting everything you've said. So forgive me for just, you know, kind of saying just my comments, my observations, my very initial ones on this idea that, you know, of love and love as a society, but represented by Halim very much in this kind of individual act of getting on the bike on your own, really. Even with Shadia, it's a very intimate kind of individual moment. As you say, the shadow of the other people are there, but really they're on their own, and they have this freedom. And that's a fantasy, because the orchestra, which is really supporting the music, is not seen. And in cinema, with this kind of music, as you touched on, they're able to do that. They can sort of suspend reality in that way, and you just don't see the orchestra. Whereas with Tarab, which is, you know, with the previous era of Tarab, which Halim is, you know, kind of presenting himself as the kind of, not antidote to, but the kind of, I am new Tarab, I am, you know, he's responding to this period. It could not be, you couldn't really separate the singer from the music and the group visually in the same way. And there's this kind of contradiction here, where Halim's music is representing all these notions of the individual and freedom and dynamism and stuff, with, as you know, a fixed composition and orchestra, which you don't see visually. But the music that came before was very fluid and compositionally not set, and reliant very much on group interaction and the we and the us in society. And it came from a time when, you know, when they were discussing also what it meant to be a modern citizen. You know, the 1919 revolution and one before that in the 80s. So it's so interesting that I don't have a clear question on that, but it's this kind of contradiction in the cinema is, I think, not really achievable in another medium.
Yeah. No, that's thanks, Yara, and you know, that you've inspired a lot of this in various ways, and I hugely enjoyed the Naguib Rehani, which is just such a lovely scene, and I think it speaks volumes, actually. So thanks for that. I mean, yeah, so you said several things that are just of great interest to me. I mean, one thing, and this is a conversation that is kind of ongoing a little bit between the two of us, which is how one thinks these revolutions together, not just 1952, but also 1919, and perhaps Tahrir as well, that there is something to be gained, I think, thinking through and across a whole century here, rather than just excuse me, rather than just focusing on this one moment. So that's definitely something for me to think about. And yes, I mean, it's something that's coming up in our ongoing conversations about music and films at the moment. Seeing things in a slightly longer durée, in a slightly over a slightly longer period of time, to think these questions through about the relationship between kind of emotion, tarab, civility, citizenship, and revolution. So that's super interesting to me. I mean, the image of the kind of another thing you've touched on that I want to think more about, or I find a better way of thinking about, which is the singularity of this figure on his bike. I mean, the thing about a bike is that they really are made for one. Okay, you can tuck somebody on the back, but it looks a bit uncomfortable, and it's a slightly odd kind of arrangement, and it's an odd arrangement for a couple as well. If this is about not just romantic but revolutionary coupledom, I think it's a rather odd and perhaps rather telling kind of image. And Shadia looks very uncomfortable sitting there on the back of the bike, and you just see her head kind of poking up over al-Halim's shoulders rather uncomfortably. I think it says something kind of uncomfortable, I think, at the heart of these kind of, as it were, revolutionary and romantic arrangements regarding coupledom. al-Halim, he does seem to be much more comfortable when he's got the bike to himself, and of course he's speeding around Cairo in Hibbik. How are we to interpret that singularity and that kind of agility and that speed? It seems to me that the couple is still somehow implied in that scene. I mean, al-Halim is always a couple minus one, isn't he? There's always, as it were, a kind of the absent partner who's never there, but is somehow felt on the screen. So there's something, I think, that I want to find a better way of getting at and think more about in terms of both romantic and revolutionary coupledom, and what the bicycle actually does to that idea. And I think it does something slightly troubling and slightly complex. So yeah, no, that's a great tip as well. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
So there is another question in the chat from Kaukab Tawfiq. Can we relate this nostalgia to al-Halim era with the current need of nationalism and Wataniya under Sisi presidency? So I see also many effort in this direction with the other culture icons and music genre.
Yeah, so the whole kind of question of Wataniya is, I mean, we're just, already and immediately in a world of satire, aren't we? I'm thinking of Bassam Youssef, and I'm thinking about his al-Halim parody. So this was a very famous kind of comedian and commentator who came up with a great imitation, kind of spoof, we would say in English, of a sort of comic sketch of al-Halim singing, what was it, Watani al-Akbar, one of the great kind of nationalist anthems, and they changed all of the words to reflect very cynically on the kind of decrepit state of the nation. And it was very famous and celebrated, and it got the comic in question, of course, in a lot of trouble. So we're already in a world of kind of parody and satire, it seems to me, when we're talking about Wataniya under Sisi, and indeed over the whole recent revolutionary period. I suppose, from my perspective, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, there was a relatively thin line between the revolutionary and the romantic, between the artifeya and the wataniya. I suppose you could say that the two musical idioms were kind of close to one another. And if you think about, to think of one of al-Halim's overtly political songs, Surah, perhaps there are some people here who know that, it's quite difficult to distinguish from his romantic songs, actually, that there was kind of romance to al-Halim's, to the wataniya, to the nationalist anthems that al-Halim sung, which he always sang from a rather individualistic, sentimental kind of perspective, which lent them, whatever one thinks about the politics of that moment and politics of that time, which lent those songs, whether it's Surah or whether it's Zikriyati or any of these kind of the nationalist anthems from that particular moment, it lent them a certain kind of charm. I mean, there was ingenuity, there was wit, there was charm to them. I mean, do I have to say that all of that wit and ingenuity and charm over the last 20 years and all of the terrible trials and torments that Egypt has gone through, all of that has gone, all of that has disappeared. What passes for nationalist anthems today are terrible at every imaginable possible level. And so no wonder, of course, people, no matter what their politics are, no matter how they're looking back on the 1950s and the 1960s, see an intelligence, a musical intelligence, a political intelligence that has just not been part of contemporary Egyptian life, certainly for most of the last 50 years. So yeah, that's a very well put question. Thank you for it.
Thank you. We have maybe one couple of minutes for the last question or comment, if you like.
Thanks very much for the comments and questions. It's lovely to see the names of some familiar names and some old friends, people I haven't seen for a very long time. Thanks for coming. And thanks for your comments and questions. And by all means, send them to me. The bike brims with optimism in this sense and authenticity. And maybe my final comment, Yara Salahuddin says, the bike brims with optimism in this sense and authenticity. And as those of you who know me as a Londoner, you'll know that I live and breathe my bicycle. I'm a passionate cyclist. I cannot observe these scenes without thinking about the way in which I cycle about London, the way that I observe all of the current extremely interesting conflicts and debates and discussions going on about cycling access, who is cycling, who isn't cycling, who needs to be brought into this, is this just a white and middle class obsession, or is this genuinely going to do anybody any good? The whole question of the bike, I think it's not just optimism and authenticity, or urban authenticity as far as Cairo in the 1960s is concerned. I think it's also optimism and authenticity in terms of London in 2021 and perhaps your Italian cities as well. Yes. Thanks for that comment.
Yes, exactly. So again, a virtual applause and thanks ever so much for this talk. And thank you everyone for attending. Thanks, Martin. Thank you.